Many thanks to Paola for suggesting that I might say a few words this evening about Dasein's analysis. In anticipation of the publication later this year of the third of the SEA dialogue series, which is the Renaissance of Dasein's analysis. What does existential really mean? Which I prepared in collaboration with a Viennese colleague, Dasein's analyst Tamás Fazekas. I hope that as a result of tonight's discussion, you will read our dialogues when they're published. There's so much more to say about Dasein's analysis than I will be able to compress in a little under 2 hours. So this will be, for the most part, a discussion for the newcomer to Dasein's analysis. But I hope that some of you who have a greater familiarity with this will have some penetrating questions as we go along. But I'm assuming that it's a rather new thing for most of the people who are tuning in, or it's not especially familiar recently. So first, a few words are in order. I have a prepared statement. It shouldn't last too long. I hope that we'll have most of the time to talk with each other, to take some questions, have some discussion. And do let me know if the volume and such is okay. I think it should be. So first, a few words are in order about the word, Dasein's analysis. Then, by way of introduction, I will briefly review the history of Dasein's analysis as an approach to therapy up to the present time. I will conclude with some comments on its current status and prospects as I see them. My perspective is that what the founder of what we'll term psychotherapeutic Dasein's analysis left us was not fully realized in his practice, but its time has come. A sketch of Dasein's analysis was drawn by Medard Boss, whom I'll talk about shortly. But its promise is only now beginning to be kept. For many young counselors and psychotherapists, the word Dasein's analysis may be new. Throughout its history outside of German-speaking Europe, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, the word has fallen hard on the air for us Anglophones. So to those unfamiliar with German word patterns, it's difficult to sound out and pronounce even on first sight. But let's have a go at it. Dasein's analysis is a direct transliteration of the German word Daseinsanalyse. So you can hear there's not much of a difference, except for the suffix. They sound pretty much exactly the same. A little bit more about the word. Dasein's analysis is a compound of the German word Dasein and the English word analysis, which is based on the Greek analysis. The word is modeled on the word psychoanalysis. So, by the way, is the practice of Dasein's analysis itself modeled on psychoanalysis. Taking apart the word psychoanalysis, we easily see it means analysis of the psyche. Similarly, we can say Dasein's analysis is analysis of the Dasein. Now, since everyone thinks she knows what psyche and analysis denote. The meaning of psychoanalysis seems straightforward enough, but it isn't really, since Freud's practice was an analysis of man's soul, capital M, man's soul, not his psyche. The word itself is a bit misleading and has been for more than a century. The latter, or the psyche part, was reserved for his theoretical model of, or metapsychology. Like the term psyche, psychoanalysis became a household word. Psychoanalysis has been familiar now for more than a century, since the first English translations of Freud were made by Abraham Brill here in the States in 1912. And then, of course, there followed very quickly the long labor of the Strachey's and others there in London. Filmmakers such as Alfred Hitchcock were fascinated by psychoanalysis. So were popular novelists such as J.D. Salinger here in the States. But the word Daseinanalysis still remains foreign to most Anglophone readers and speakers. Just a bit more on words. Freud coined the term psychoanalyse, hyphenated at first, by the way, as the name for a method of research, a theory of the mind or the psyche, and his technique of therapeutic practice, the therapy of the soul. In practice, analysis of the soul, if we really translate this word psychoanalysis properly, nevertheless consists in a dissection of the personality, according to Freud, into its mental elements, ideas, images, wishes, feelings, which are then, in psychoanalysis, decoded by tracing their verbal associations to memories and patterns of memories from early childhood experiences. Freud believed that the most pressing contents of our soul were hidden away in what he termed the unconscious. There, he said, we find much that we know in some sense, but do not consciously know. An odd sort of knowing, yes? An odd sort of knowledge. Well, its content makes surprise appearances, though, as we all know, slips of the tongue, jokes, dreams, and symptoms. The term Daseinsanalyse, then, just to sum this part up, had its origin as a version of psychoanalyse. This revision, this new version of psychoanalysis occurred when, in the 1940s, the Swiss spa psychiatrist and friend of Freud's, Ludwig Binswanger, lived from 1881 to 1966, began to speak of what he termed Daseinsanalysis, rather than psychoanalysis of his good friend Freud's practice. That is what we will want to call psychiatric Daseinsanalysis. And there's a very important distinction that I'll make shortly between psychiatric Daseinsanalysis and what we're here to talk about tonight. For Binswanger, this was now in the setting, the inpatient setting in which he worked, was an analysis of Dasein rather than the soul. He and Freud wrote to each other about this. The correspondence is very interesting to follow. According to Binswanger, being human in and of itself entails a certain basic suffering in all of us, which emanates from the knowledge we have of our existence. Such suffering, Binswanger said, was unavoidable to some degree in everyone, but in some individuals, it became more bothersome. To finish with Binswanger, providing love, Binswanger thought, in the setting in which he practiced again, which was a very comfortable spa sanatorium setting with his well-heeled patients. Providing love in that setting, Binswanger thought, is the psychiatrist's means of alleviating the greater suffering about existence that some individuals experience. It then moderates to just the everyday sort of suffering in our existence that we all know as human beings. So much, so far, Binswanger. Not long after, by the way, there's some who would suggest that it wasn't Binswanger himself who first used the term, but that's open to some discussion. Jakob Wirsch, another Swiss, might have been the one to suggest that here was a good term for what Binswanger was thinking about, a nice way to take psychoanalysis and turn it into another kind of analysis verbally. Now, moving along, not long after Binswanger's innovation, another Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who had been in analysis with Freud reconceived Daseinsanalysis as therapeutic Daseinsanalysis, the psychotherapeutic Daseinsanalysis, which was to be distinguished from the psychiatric Daseinsanalysis of Binswanger for some reasons that'll become clear. Most important of which being that it was provided in the sort of setting that Freud had provided psychoanalysis, namely on an outpatient basis, as we would say, in the privacy of a part of the home, usually the analyst. Well, this was Medard Boss. Medard Boss, born 1903, died in 1990. Just to add a bit about him from his biography, he was also closely associated with Freud's presumptive heir, Carl Gustav Jung, for nearly a decade, worked very closely with Jung at the Burg Hölzli Hospital in Zurich, about an hour from Binswanger's spa sanitarium, which was in Kreuzlingen on Lake Constance, the Bodensee. Well, Boss denied against Binswanger that there is an inherent suffering about existing. Instead, he saw that in certain individuals, the freedom to realize their possibilities had been constricted. It's a very different take than had been Binswanger's. He also emphasized the spiritual life of his patients, something that Freud and Binswanger, as we know, had discarded as a mere remnant of a childhood dependency. As we know from Freud and his followers, spiritual life is an illusion. We're fundamentally reasoning beings. Rationality is at stake in those who are neurotic, said Freud. The spiritual life doesn't play a part. except as perhaps a symptom for something that has gone wrong. By contrast, Boss gave it a central place in his psychotherapeutic Daseinanalysis. And just a quick note on that, in his late midlife, Boss, fully trained psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, had worked in the Swiss Army, had a bit of a crisis. And while he had been invited to lecture in India and Sri Lanka, what was then called Sri Lanka, he turned it into a sort of pilgrimage, a voyage. And so apart from lecturing, which he did in Lucknow and other places in the subcontinent, he spent 2 very long periods of time in meditation practice with more than one guru, one of whom, Govinda Kaul, he speaks of very highly in his book. A wonderful book I would recommend for everybody to get a hold of if possible. A Psychiatrist Discovers India. Boss had been born into the sort of standard Swiss Protestantism of his era, born in 1903. But here was somebody who in the 50s, right, in his 50s, decided to make this voyage. Something was troubling him, and off he went, not once, but twice, and spent, there are photos of him in ashrams. Now this is, you can imagine a very starched, patrician Swiss psychiatrist in an ashram at the age of 50. Something has happened that has compelled him to do this. He returned. That little anecdote to point out perhaps one of the sources of why the spiritual, not the religious, not the church connection, but the spiritual dimension was so important for those with whom he worked in what he was now calling psychotherapeutic Daseinsanalysis. Both Binswanger and Boss had taken their cue for modifying psychoanalysis from the German phenomenologist Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger, born in 1889, died in 1976. This is Heidegger, the Heidegger who introduced Dasein as a technical term in his early writing. Binswanger eventually admitted that he had gotten Heidegger wrong. Buss, who worked closely with Heidegger regularly from 1959 to 1969 in a series of seminars for psychiatrists, was said to have gotten Heidegger right. Some of you will know of these as the famous Zollikon seminars, named after a district in Zurich where Buss lived, and where happily I can say I had an interview of about 45 minutes with him in 1976. More of that perhaps a little bit later on. In fact, Heidegger and Buss not only worked closely in this connection as co-teachers, co-seminar directors, but eventually they traveled together. Their wives, their families traveled together. Sometimes they traveled alone. Getting Heidegger actually out of a sort of funk that he was in following the end of World War II. Buss, in a sense, became Heidegger's Daseinsanalyst, though I don't think either one of them would have admitted that. But their long trips and times together certainly allowed for this. Some of what remains of their meetings, conversations, and letters, but just little excerpts, bits of that sort of thing are published in the Solikon seminars. And again, for those of you who know this already so well, it's no news. But if this is new to you, it's very interesting to compare the substantive material in the protocols of the seminars themselves, which ran again for a decade, usually twice a year for a couple of weeks running. And these very private conversations and letters, most of which are still hiding out somewhere. That is, for the most part, due to Boss's family and estate, who have pointed out that there's a lot of sensitive material in Boss's papers about other patients, but there's probably also a lot of sensitive material about the collaboration between Heidegger and Boss. The last thing I'd mention about Heidegger and Boss personally is that Heidegger eventually oversaw the writing page by page. He saw every page of manuscript of Boss's magnum opus, published in 1971, Existential Foundations of Medicine and Psychology. And to put this in a time perspective, this is now just 2 years after the last of the seminars and 5 years before Heidegger's death in 1976. He was an old man when he gave the seminars. He was a much older man when he worked on the manuscript with Boss. But we know that he did, and we have lots of examples of the in the papers of Heidegger that are held in Marburg. One other note about their personal relationship that might account for why so much of it was censored, so much of the private stuff was censored, is that something went wrong in the relationship in the last 4 or 5 years, and I'm not quite sure what it was about, but it's of interest. It's a work in progress to discover what that might have been. But for the most part, from about 1942 until 1972, Boss was preoccupied with Heidegger, and as I've recounted, spent quite a lot of time together. We're interested in people and their relationships, and so it's perhaps worth noting that this is the only real collaboration that Heidegger ever had with another writer, with another thinker. He was very much an isolate. So for him to have done what he did with Boss over the long period of time speaks to something important, I think, in the relationship, and certainly in the way Boss began to construe human relationships from a Dasein's analytic perspective, from a Heideggerian perspective. Well, I think we will be misled if we try to understand Dasein's analysis in the same way we do psychoanalysis, because here now we want to see some differences emerging. In Dasein's analysis, there is no dissection of the personality or decoding of the contents of the mind recovered by memory. Instead, for Dasein's analysis, analysis takes on its original Greek meaning, and he got this from Heidegger. The original Greek doesn't mean to take apart, to dissect, as in chemical analysis. It means to free up or loosen up. Pieces might remain, parts might remain, but the impetus was to loosen, free what had been compacted, perhaps pressed together to form that image. And in this case, the analysis, the freeing up, is of Dasein. But what is this Dasein that is to be freed up? In ordinary, everyday German, the word Dasein, if you take a taxi drive somewhere, it's common enough to hear, just means existence. Philosophically, it means existence as a predicate, a possible predicate of any being, of anything that is. I'll take a little philosophical sidebar here. We therefore say lions and tigers exist, but unicorns don't exist. Right? They're imaginary. Lions and tigers are real, since we can perceive them with our senses, and this confirms that they exist. This is the predicate, existence, added on to anything else you might want to say about that creature. It's the most famous being, the existence of which has been pondered, is, of course, God. God. Does God exist, we ask? So proofs for the existence of this being, God, that there's the predicate, is existence. God, the subject matter of theology, heroic attempts at proofs for the existence of God were contrived by Catholic theologians, including Anselm of Canterbury, Thomas Aquinas, who probably is, as the doctor of the church most associated with this, identified 5 such proofs. Unfortunately, along came the German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who presented each proof that had come down from scholasticism with the full power of reason, flawless reasoning for the existence of God, and then went on to dismantle each proof with the same logical precision. Proving the existence of God proved to be more difficult than that of lions and tigers. What speak of the existence of less important beings than God, of course, and that would be, for our purposes, human beings, people, not animal beings, not divine beings. During the first quarter of the 20th century, turn to Heidegger, between 1923 and 1927, roughly, Heidegger made the existence of human beings the topic of his major work. His major work came to be translated as Being and Time. In it is what he called an analytics of existence. An analytics of existence. I probably should be able to show this to you, but the word is Daseinsanalytik, which you can hear it, analytics of Dasein, in his major work, provided the basis for the revision of psychoanalysis known as Daseinsanalysis. Now the soul of man, soul of men and women, was no longer the focus of therapy, but rather his or her Dasein. By the way, the term analytics here in Daseinsanalytik derives from Aristotle's usage in his logical works, where it refers to simply the careful, stepwise reasoning according to the rules of logic. Yet another sense of analytic, of analysis, of analysian So everyone who is an existential analyst will be familiar with Heidegger's analytics of the structure of existence, since it's the foundation of all existential psychotherapies. We can skip further discussion of it. On the other hand, we need to be careful, I think, to distinguish between this analytics from the analysis of Dasein's analysis, the loosening up or freeing up of Dasein, of existence. So you see, Heidegger's fresh usage of this word Dasein takes an everyday, commonly used words and gives it a technical meaning, which no longer refers to a predicate of beings, but allow me a little bit more philosophical side, but instead to what he called the ontological structure, that is to say, the possibility of any human being's human experience and behavior. This was the source of the idea of Dasein's analysis, and historically for all of the forms of existential analysis, which can ultimately be traced back to this work, to a very short passage, actually, in Being and Time. It's been forgotten. I hope I'll be able to remedy that a little bit tonight, because there's an important distinction here that is relevant to making Dasein's analysis, at least as I understand it, compelling, clear and compelling. So once again, Dasein, back to this word, is the structure of possibility of a human being's existing. Now, here again, there are two words that are very different that sound alike. Heidegger's talk of Dasein, existence, is to be distinguished from what he called our existing. And for this, he used the word existence. You can still find this in the existence therapy that is commonly practiced. Alfred Langley, for example. By the way, I imagine everybody is aware of, perhaps 2 years ago, the Wiley Handbook of Existential Analysis. And so I'd refer everybody to go back and look at this panoply of forms of existential psychotherapy. But my point is just this, that Heidegger is talking in at two levels. The ontological level, which is Dasein, namely the possibility for any instance of existing, mine, yours, existence. It's the structure of the very possibility of being human. On the other hand, existence, says Heidegger, is the very essence of Dasein, of existence. So I hope the two words and the possible complications that they raise becomes a little clearer. The new usage, which at first presented some difficulties, especially in squaring it with the everyday use of the term, was the brainchild of this country lad. Some of you have read about Heidegger, know something about him, but perhaps you don't know that he was very much a rural lad, Catholic, the first son of conservative Catholic parents who lived in the Black Forest area of southwest Germany, close to Switzerland. So Catholic were they that the Heideggers named their son after the patron saint of the church, where young Martin's father was a sexton. And he was also a barrel maker in town. So this was not a wealthy family. This was, for example, Binswanger came from a very long line of psychiatrists. Karl Jaspers, another close associate, professionals, people of standing. Heidegger was none of that. He was quite shy. He was sometimes a little hard to get along with, but the point of this biographical detail is that he was not the sort of sophisticate that you would expect to have produced the ideas that, as far as I can tell, have brought us all here together, and perhaps have shaken up psychoanalysis at its roots, which of course are there in Freud's psychoanalysis. In 1927, a bit more, under pressure to publish, Heidegger brought out part of a planned, much larger work that I've mentioned, Being in Time. This is where the structure was spelled out. You may not know that it was hurriedly written. It was unfinished. It was flawed. If you try to read it in the first translation from 1962, that's impossible. I read it in 1967 for the first time, and I believed I understood what I was reading, but I've since learned that most of it simply just doesn't make sense unless you look at the German. And so that took a decade or two for me to catch up. But it's always surprising to me to think of this book and what's in it as being some sort of gospel. It was actually not. It was very much a series of rapidly produced thoughts, a free association, although we added certain structure at the end, headings and the like. In any case, to continue a bit more with the philosophical background, he termed what he was doing here a hermeneutic, phenomenological ontology of the human being. A phenomenological approach to the human being. Unlike that of his teacher, who had originated phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, one that was hermeneutic, based on interpretation, not on the direct intuition of essences, mostly in consciousness, which he had learned from Husserl. But this fundamental ontology, at the core of which was this strikingly new notion of Dasein. It was a momentous work that made possible all the forms of existential analysis, and above all, Dasein's analysis. What a mouthful. Hermeneutic phenomenological ontology. Again, for some, it's well known. For others, it would require some more discussion to make it a little bit clearer. In any case, it won't be necessary to do that to get to what we have to say about Dasein's analysis. Heidegger later admitted, by the way, also that his project had failed, that while the book was important and he was certainly glad that it had made him famous, it was a failure. Yet out of it came this notion of Dasein that if we dig far enough, each of us will find is at the core of our practice, whatever we may call it as existential analysts. And in an English translation, okay, enough of Heidegger. In an English translation of the first book to compare psychoanalysis and Dasein's analysis, which was written by Medard Buss, an error was made that has had consequences which remain today. We need to clear this up a bit. Edward Boss, it turns out, never wrote a book called Psychoanalysis and Dasein's Analysis. That's how it was published. That would have rendered psychoanalysis and Dasein's Analysis. It would have compared Freud's science with Boss's new approach to psychotherapy based on Heidegger's philosophy. That is true. What he did publish, however, was a book called Psychoanalysis and the Analytics of Dasein. The actual title of the book was Psychoanalyse und Dasein's Analytik. There was no mention of analysis in there. It referred essentially to this philosophical notion from Heidegger's fundamental ontology, or ontology of the human being, of the being there. By the way, if you take this word Dasein apart, it's simply being there. I might say then to everybody here, thank you for your Dasein. Thank you for being here. That gets to the heart of the notion pretty quickly. But in any case, Boss's book led to some mischief in the mistranslation of the title. In it, he does compare psychoanalysis with the new Dasein's analysis, but not from the perspective of Freud's metapsychology, but from the perspective of Heidegger's analytics structure, this structure of Dasein, famously including anxiety, guilt, language, and above all, being with, which we'll come to quite soon. So much mischief resulted from the mistranslation of the title. Hopefully, by the end of our discussion this evening, we'll have gained some clarity about the matter. So briefly, the analytics of Dasein is a philosophical matter, but the analysis of existence, that's our interest, is a matter for therapists. Of importance to those of us who work with people in the therapeutic situation is an element of which there are many of the structure of Dasein that I just mentioned, that will occupy us now for most of the rest of this part of my presentation. And that is what he called being with. Mit sein, mit with, sein, being with. As an essential structural element of Dasein existence, and equally important with all of the other elements, being with implies that a single human being is inconceivable. This is one of the first remarkable conclusions about Dasein's analysis that we have to make. This idea that it's inconceivable to imagine an isolated Dasein. By its very nature, it consists, among other things, in being with others from the start. To speak of an I implies that the he or she of that I is always already a being with other human beings. In the beginning is the we. To be human, then, is first to be there with others from the start. Be there with. Such being, by the way, makes possible even the famous I-thou relationship described by the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber. Another Martin, who, by the way, was a colleague and friend of Martin Heidegger, They met often, were close. He was close to Viktor Frankl as well. I think many of you know really intimately his work, you know it really intimately. The correspondence between Frankl and Heidegger is in preparation, and that should make for some interesting reading within the next year and a half when it's published. In any case, something else that gets lost in translation, this I, thou, we don't say thou anymore. But in German, you can refer to somebody in a very intimate way, or you can refer to them in a formal way. Most of the time, we use the formal, but Buber is, of course, pointing to is this intimate second person singular, thou, you, that could not happen, could not occur, were it not for this initial being with that Heidegger had articulated in his fundamental ontology. Let's pause just to say a little more about Dasein, just to be sure there are no misunderstandings, so that we can see how Dasein's analysis is different from the other forms of existential analysis, and for that matter, any other modality of psychotherapy, in my view, including psychoanalysis. Every instance of Dasein begins to sound easier to be at home with if you repeat it a few times. Every instance of Dasein unfolds as a concrete life, a biography that begins with the event of birth. But this is what is remarkable about Dasein, and may have slipped out of the picture of much of existential analysis for having been forgotten. Dasein is genderless, sexless, without race or ethnicity, talent, good or bad genes, and all the rest. If you want to take the perspective of the natural sciences, which by the way aren't possible without Dasein, a zygote, a simple zygote with its XX or XY chromosomes is already Dasein. The embryo, even before it differentiates into male and female at about 6 weeks, is Dasein. It being with is implicit from the beginning. There's a very interesting discussion of this on just when we can say Dasein originates, and it certainly originates in the womb. Embryogenesis, an intrauterine life, fetal life that eventuate in birth, and a human life with a history begins to unfold, already implies Dasein. Existing already implies existence, Dasein. Those of us who are Dasein's analysts then never forget that sitting across from us, though embodied as male or female, Caucasian or Black, Hispanic or Muslim, gay or straight, is in the first instance Dasein, which is indifferent to the human being who unfolds as a life, the life of detail that interests us so much. To put this otherwise, perhaps too technically, but on the basis of what I said a little bit earlier, ontologically speaking, that is, with respect to possibility, there is not first a person of flesh and blood sitting there before me, but instead Dasein, the existing of which unfolds, the existence of which unfolds. Ontically speaking, however, that is with respect to the actualities of that person who's there with all of the accidents of her fate, right? Having been born in a certain place, in a certain time, in a certain era, with certain parents, with the possibility of being 5'7" instead of 4'11", such as my grandma was. From that perspective, there is, of course, also, in quotes, a living, breathing human being. But here is the key. In the order of the real, the ontological takes precedence over the ontic, while in the order of experience, the ontic reality takes precedence and is necessary for us to see the ontological status of that living, breathing, experiencing actuality. So just to illustrate and bring this a little bit down to earth, here are two invented examples of such ontic reality. A young man, let's say, who was born in Scarborough into a Protestant family, who has no interest in literature and philosophy, but prefers to tinker with cars, who is of above average intelligence, brown hair, big hands, speaks quietly. There's an ontic actuality. How about this? A middle-aged woman who was born in London into a wealthy Catholic family, to a Pakistani father and a mother whose family stretches back through countless generations of local landowners. You can bring to mind any such example from your own practice. Now comes the crucial question. From these two examples, or from the examples of the hundreds of people that all of you together and we have met with, what matters more for the therapeutic endeavor? The Dasein or the existence? The existing, the existence, the existing. The Dasein or the flesh and blood other existing human being there in his or her existing existence? What matters more, the ontological structure, Dasein, just to put this in slightly different terms, or the who, the existence, the existing in his or her uniqueness? The answer, neither. Both are equally important. But for the Dasein's analyst, her phenomenological gaze focuses on the existence, the Dasein of the other, not on his or her being, existing, existence. So you'll notice another problem of language. In the previous discussion, it's liable to trip us up, but it's easy enough to sort out, I think. If we dispense with the awkward term Dasein and settle on existence as a good English word for it, understood in a Heideggerian sense, we see that it is contrasted with existing. I'm repeating, but I hope for a positive outcome. Recall then Heidegger's sentence: the essence of existence is in its existing, its existence. In the history of existential analysis in general, and of Dasein's analysis in particular, which I think you might begin to see are perhaps in many ways quite different, another linguistic conflation of usage led to quite a lot of confusion. So let me once again go over the sentence a bit more slowly, since everything depends upon what it communicates in order to appreciate what's special about Dasein's analysis. To smooth the way, let me offer an alternative translation of Dasein. The word itself, compounded of the adverb da, by the way, which can mean here, there, or both here and there, and even when, under certain circumstances. So it has a spatial and a temporal sense, da, and the verb to be. It can therefore nicely be translated as being there, or there being, which is a little more awkward, there being. The latter is the choice of the great Heidegger scholar, psychoanalyst, and Dasein's analyst, Father William Richardson, whose rendering actually got Heidegger's approval, there being. Well, in terms of the therapeutic setting, with this new translation, we can say, seen ontologically, being there in the full reality of her existence, the analyst of being there, the Dasein's analyst, is there with another instance of being there, another Dasein, that's you or me, who is also there in the full reality of his or her existence. Seen ontically, there is the being of the other, an embodied who of flesh and blood, who for some remarkable reason has come to spend an hour or so with you or me. When the situation is therapeutic, something more is going on than in nearly every other everyday human encounter of Dasein and Dasein. So you can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm almost finished with the philosophical part. What is that therapeutic something? It's easy to formulate, and this would be a pretty basic statement of Dasein's analysis. As I understand it, Dasein's analysis is the freeing up of the structure of the possibility of existing, namely the freeing up of the existence of the other. But what about this existing, this who? Again, isn't he or she also some sort of what, a being that has come to us? I return to one of those examples. It's this ontic reality, something we have to reckon with. I'll take you into my consulting room. If we give one of those two individuals, I'll take the chap from Scarborough. If we give him the appropriate cue that indicates our attentiveness and openness to him, the young man will tell us many things. Perhaps he cannot sleep, and when he does, he has terrible nightmares. He will tell us many things if we have made it comfortable for him to do so by reassuring him that anything goes, verbally, anything goes between us. We thus invoke the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis. Here are the connections. One of the principal connections between psychoanalysis and Dasein's analysis comes into view. As we listen, we begin to understand, however, the constraints of his Dasein. So simple enough. This is a young man, so he'll never get pregnant. He will never experience menstrual periods. He has external genitals. Other details, though not as fundamental, are no less important. You mentioned he's not very athletic, but very clever about fixing cars. He tells us he's not very wealthy, but his family inculcated in him a sturdy work ethic. He attends Mass every Sunday. He rather likes the look of men more than women, he tells me. He wishes he were taller, and so on. Some of this might be adjusted. He may convert to Islam, but within the limits of his anatomy and physiology, his ontic reality, he's a male. He has not acted on his sexual orientation because he's Catholic, but he might at some point. Or he might take holy orders and become a priest. The more we talk, the more options for unfolding his life turn up. Some are newly discovered. Heidegger accounted for this, the constraints of circumstance, anatomical, constitutional, geographic, initial, cultural, when he introduced into his fundamental ontology another element of the structure of Dasein, which says that in each case we have been, the usage sounds strange, but we've been thrown into a situation. He uses this word thrown. A certain body, some innate tendencies, a locale, a time in history. Why did he choose this word, thrown? Thrown into Scarborough there, London or New York. He chose this odd formulation, this odd term, thrown, based on a verb that means to be born. It's not spelled out in Being in Time, but there's very clearly a connection in his mind between the origin of Dasein and the particular situation that everybody finds herself in or himself in. If you'll recall, this is Geworfenheit, just means thrownness, having been thrown. These accidents of fate mean that each existence, each existing, will be unique, and that some actualities, as we saw in the example, are precluded. And that will be true for every human being. Each biography with its world is different from that of each other human being's biography with its world. In this sense, we are not the same. On the other hand, inasmuch as each of us first exists, we are all the same. It's to the latter that Dasein's analysis is directed. And this is what distinguishes it from psychiatry, existential analysis, and every other form of psychotherapy, counseling, coaching, education, social work available to us. I promise to be brief. What remains is to describe the goal of Dasein's analysis and to say something about what being a Dasein analyst means. For Dasein's analysis, we've seen each human being is unique among all other humans, other human beings, not only given his or her thrownness, but also in that he or she is never someone once and for all and as such, until the moment of death.